It feels like, every day we hear about some new act of violence, some societal breakdown. It's almost become background noise, hasn't it?
It has, unfortunately.
But I think, how often do we actually stop and ask, why? Like, why is this happening? Particularly with people who weren't always bad,
Yeah.
weren't born evil.
Yeah, it's all too easy to just slab a label on someone and say, that's a bad person. But
Yeah.
it's much more complicated than that, isn't it?
And that's kind of the whole point of what we're trying to do here today. You sent me this fascinating stuff. It's from this YouTube channel, psychosocial.
Right?
And it really takes this sort of combined psychological and sociological look at where social violence comes from.
Hmm.
And I think it's really important to say right off the bat, we're not trying to excuse anyone's actions or anything like that. What we're trying to do is figure out, how do people get from a seemingly normal life to a place where they commit acts of aggression or even become radicalized?
Exactly. Because if we don't understand, how can we possibly hope to even begin to address the problem, right?
So that's our mission today, for you, our listener. We're going to unpack sort of what are the things that can lead someone down this path, especially people who weren't, like I said, predisposed to violence. And the source material starts off by asking this really interesting question. It says, how do we even begin to differentiate between all the different kinds of people who commit violent acts?
Yeah.
I mean, you've got everything from, like, the sadist, the person who really enjoys hurting other people, to someone who might be suffering from a severe mental illness that distorts their perception of reality, to someone who's just under so much pressure that they kind of snap.
Yeah, and as the source points out, you can have two people who commit acts of violence that look very similar from the outside.
Right.
But the underlying motivations, the context, the background of each person could be totally different.
Totally different.
And that's where this whole idea of categorization comes in. It's not about simplifying things or putting people in neat little boxes, but it's about understanding those nuances so that we can then tailor our response appropriately. Yeah. So just to give us a framework, the source actually lays out 5 broad categories of violent individuals. And these are, they're broad, but I think they're really helpful. So you've got the psychopathic or antisocial types. These are the people who are callous, they lack empathy, and in some cases, they even get pleasure out of causing harm to others.
All right.
Then you've got the psychotic. So these are people who their violence stems from some kind of break with reality, some kind of, severe mental illness.
Yeah.
Then there's the instrumental or ideological. These are the people who use violence as a means to an end. So they might have a political or social objective, and they see violence as a way to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
Then, and this is really where we're going to focus today, you've got the reactive or radicalized individuals. The source also uses the terms victimized and desperate to describe them.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's just kind of this catch-all category of other.
So obviously, to really get a full picture, you have to kind of consider all of these. But like I said, for our deep dive today, we're going to focus on that 4th category, the reactive or radicalized, victimized, desperate individuals. These are the people who were not necessarily, violent by nature, but who became that way because of a whole bunch of external pressures, because they felt unseen, unheard, and they experienced this deep sense of injustice.
Exactly. I think that's really the key distinction, is that their violence is a reaction to something rather than an inherent part of their personality.
Okay, so let's get into the process. How does this transformation actually happen? And the source material actually lays out this really interesting 6-stage process that describes how a seemingly normal person can become radicalized and aggressive. And the first stage, I think this is really key, is repeated failures and feeling ignored. So this is that feeling of constantly putting in effort, trying to do the right thing, and just hitting a wall again and again.
Yeah.
And not only you're hitting a wall, but it's like the systems that are supposed to help you, whether it's education, work, family, immigration, whatever it might be, are either actively working against you or they're just completely indifferent to your existence.
Yeah.
And the core feeling there is just, I don't matter.
Right.
It's like my efforts don't matter. My existence doesn't matter.
And that can be incredibly demoralizing, especially if it's something that's happening repeatedly over time.
Absolutely. And that leads right into the second stage, which is accumulation of anger and hidden shame. Because if you can't express that frustration outwardly in a healthy way, it's going to turn inwards. And so the anger builds up, but it's also mixed with this like really corrosive sense of shame.
Yeah.
The source uses some examples like, I'm useless, I'm a loser. It's like this self-degradation.
Yeah, exactly. And that shame can be really hard to shake off because it's not just anger at the situation, it's anger at yourself for not being able to overcome it.
Right. And then comes stage 3, which is feeling socially excluded and experiencing injustice. And this is where the comparison with others becomes really acute. You start to see people who seem to have it all. They're successful, they're accepted, they're loved. You start to think, why them and not me? What's the difference between us? Why am I constantly failing while they're succeeding?
And that can lead to a really profound sense of unfairness, like the world is rigged against you.
Totally. And all of this starts to wear down your sense of self, which is stage 4, gradual collapse of healthy identity. You start to feel like you're fundamentally flawed, broken, not even a complete person anymore, as the source puts it.
Yeah. And at this point, the individual's self-esteem has really taken a hit. They've internalized all of this negativity, and it starts to affect how they see themselves in the world.
And then, almost as a way of protecting themselves, they move into stage 5, finding a symbolic enemy.
Right.
This is where the mind needs to find someone or something to blame for all this pain and frustration.
It's a way of externalizing the blame.
Exactly. And it can be anything. A specific group of people, an ideology, the government, the system as a whole.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter, as long as there's someone or something to point the finger at.
And unfortunately, that often leads to scapegoating and prejudice.
And finally, we reach stage 6, explosion or radical action. This is the breaking point. This is where the individual feels like they have nothing left to lose. And the source describes it as a burst. It can manifest in different ways. It could be physical violence directed outward, self-destructive behavior, or even just a symbolic act of defiance against societal norms and rules.
Right. It's like all that pent-up anger and frustration has to find an outlet somewhere. So let's talk a little bit about who these people are, these individuals who fall into this reactive category, the ones who, our listener might be trying to understand better. And the source gives some really interesting characteristics.
Yeah.
So first of all, they generally don't have a prior criminal history.
Right.
They might be educated, they might have specific skills, they might have initially, really bought into the values of society, but then something happened. They experienced this significant breakdown in their sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And very often they come from middle or lower income backgrounds where they've faced repeated rejection or humiliation. So it's not like these are people who were always on the fringes of society. They were in it, and then something happened that pushed them out.
Right. They were part of the system, and then the system failed them in some way.
Now, the source also takes a step back and talks about, why do people engage in harmful behaviors in general? And it lists a whole bunch of things, and I think these are important to consider. So first of all, there's just the general psychological pressures and life stresses that we all face. Financial problems, family conflicts, work stress.
Yeah.
Then there's the impact of past experiences, especially childhood experiences. Things like neglect, exposure to violence, humiliation. These things can make it really hard for people to manage their emotions in a healthy way, and they can lead to these repeating patterns of negative behavior. Then there's mental health, obviously. Conditions like borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, depression, severe anxiety. These things can lead to irrational reactions, lack of empathy, and of course they can contribute to violence.
Right.
Then there's the broader social and cultural environment. If violence and humiliation are normalized or even encouraged in a particular community, that's going to have an impact on people's behavior.
Yeah.
And finally, there's just a lack of basic communication and anger management skills. A lot of people just never learned how to deal with conflict in a healthy way.
Yeah.
So it's really a complex web of factors that can contribute to harmful behavior.
It's rarely just one thing. Right.
It's usually a combination of things. Now, the source makes a really important point about young people, about disappointed youth. These are the kids who try hard, they have aspirations, but they're constantly met with disappointment, injustice, neglect. And that can lead to this really deep sense of failure. And it can actually make them want to lash out at the society that they feel has failed them.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous place to be because young people are still developing, they're still figuring out their place in the world.
Totally. And this brings us to a concept from social psychology called reaction to perceived injustice. Basically, when people feel like they've been treated unfairly, it can trigger these antisocial or self-destructive behaviors.
Right.
It's like if the world isn't going to play fair, then why should I?
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of problems.
Now, here's something I think is really important to think about. We as a society tend to focus on the result, right? We see the act of violence and we react to that, but we don't always stop to consider the root, the long and often complex history of pressure, emotional poverty, injustice, neglect that might have led to that act.
Yeah, and that's a problem because if we only focus on the result, we're never going to actually address the underlying causes.
And the source actually talks about reactive violence to rejection and injustice as a kind of desperate attempt to be seen, to be heard, after feeling invisible and unloved by society for so long. It even goes so far as to say that the aggressor in these cases can almost be seen as a victim themselves.
Right. It's like their cry for help has just been twisted and distorted into this destructive act.
And that really puts a lot of responsibility on our systems, doesn't it? Education, media, families, they all have a role to play in preventing this from happening.
They do. And it's not just about punishing people after they've already committed an act of violence.
Right. It's about creating a society where people feel seen, heard, and valued.
The source also talks about how this feeling of being betrayed by a system that was supposed to support you can really destroy your sense of self-worth.
Yeah.
And it can lead to the collapse of what it calls the inner child, that part of us that's vulnerable, innocent, hopeful. And when that happens, you're no longer acting from a place of logic or reason. You're acting from pure pain and anger. Then there's this really disturbing phenomenon that the source discusses, which is violence against the weak as a kind of misplaced power.
Yeah.
This is where people who have been marginalized themselves turn around and attack people who are even more vulnerable, almost as a way of reclaiming some sense of control.
Right. It's like they're reenacting the abuse that they've experienced, but on someone else.
And the source is very clear that this is not about cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's about a deep-seated inability to heal from their own wounds.
Exactly. And until they can address that underlying trauma, they're going to keep perpetuating this cycle of violence. So the source asks this really big question. Should society just react with legal repercussions? Or should we be trying to understand, listen, and prevent this from happening in the first place?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. Now, the source gets even more interesting. It brings up this neuroscience experiment from the 1980s by Benjamin Libet, which seemed to suggest that brain activity actually precedes our conscious decision-making, at least for simple actions.
Right.
So basically, your brain is already making the decision before you're even aware of it.
Yeah.
And this has huge implications for our understanding of free will, right?
It does. It really challenges this idea that we are completely in control of our actions.
And the source connects this to people who have grown up in really unjust conditions. It says, what if their violent actions aren't really conscious decisions in the traditional sense, but more like the execution of patterns that have been shaped by years of rejection, humiliation, pain, modeling of violence? Now, that's a really heavy thought, right?
It is. It makes you wonder how much agency these individuals really have.
And it also raises questions about moral responsibility.
Exactly. If free will is an illusion, then how can we hold people accountable for their actions?
And the source doesn't shy away from that question. It says, should we be labeling these people as criminals, or should we see them as affected by a social and educational system that has failed them?
Yeah. It's a really tough question to grapple with.
It is. Now, the source goes on to talk about how extreme trauma, things like rape, torture, prolonged humiliation, can actually shatter a person's sense of self. And in some cases, it can lead to them projecting that fragmentation outward, and sometimes even targeting the most vulnerable members of society, like children.
Yeah. It's like their own brokenness is reflected in the people they hurt.
And it says this realization, I am no longer whole, can actually lead people to want to destroy others, not out of cruelty, but because they can't repair themselves. And the source makes this distinction between revenge against power, which is understandable, and displacing violence onto the weak, which is often what happens because the systems that cause the harm are too big, too powerful to target directly. So people end up taking it out on those who are weaker than them, who represent their own past vulnerability.
Yeah. And that's a tragic cycle that can be really hard to break.
Now, I think one of the biggest points that the source makes is about societal blindness. We see the violence, but we don't see the suffering and trauma that's underneath it. We're quick to label people as offenders or dangerous without ever really trying to understand why they are the way they are.
Right. And that labeling can actually make things worse because it dehumanizes people and makes it harder to see them as individuals who are capable of change.
And the source points out the power dynamics here. The people who are in positions of power, who might have actually contributed to this person's path to violence, they often escape scrutiny.
Yeah. They're protected by the system, while the people who are actually suffering are the ones who get punished.
And it talks about this idea of silent violence, how society's indifference to someone's suffering can be a form of violence in itself.
Right. It's like a slow, insidious kind of violence that wears people down over time.
And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Are we choosing not to see these deeper motivations, or are we just so good at blocking them out that we don't even realize we're doing it?
I think it's probably a bit of both. We're busy, we have our own lives to worry about, and it's easier to just look away from the uncomfortable stuff.
Yeah. Now, the source also talks about the unequal access to mental health support,
Mm-hmm.
the long waiting lists, the cost of care, the lack of qualified therapists. All of these things can push people who are already struggling towards these radical reactions.
Absolutely. And it's especially tragic because these are the people who need help the most, and they're the ones who are least likely to get it.
And it's a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
The systems that are supposed to help are actually contributing to the problem by failing to provide adequate support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like they're pushing people towards the very outcomes they're trying to prevent.
And the source describes this fork in the road. When someone who has suffered for years finally reaches out for help and is met with failure, they either collapse inward into depression and passivity, or they explode outward into violence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's heartbreaking because those seem like the only two options.
They are, in many cases, and it's a reflection of how broken our systems are.
Now, the source also talks about this idea of systemic imprecision, the fact that our systems can't always differentiate between someone with a deep-seated mental illness and someone who has been driven to extremism by social, economic, or emotional pressures.
Right. And that can lead to all sorts of problems
Yep.
because the treatment that might work for one person might not work for another.
And the cost of not seeing that, of not differentiating, is immense, isn't it?
It is. We end up with people falling through the cracks, not getting the help they need, and the cycle of violence continues.
So the source identifies some groups that are particularly vulnerable to radicalization. And I think these are worth listening to. So people experiencing intense and persistent feelings of injustice, people who feel lonely and isolated, people lacking access to psychological, financial, or cultural support, people with unhealed trauma from childhood or adolescence, people who once believed in a positive future but have had that hope crushed, and people growing up in marginalized communities with high rates of violence, poverty, instability, and a lack of future prospects.
Yeah. It's a sobering list, but it's important to be aware of these risk factors.
It is. Now, the source also talks about language, which is something I don't think we talk about enough. It asks whether language can be a tool of inequality and domination, especially for immigrants or foreigners who are forced to use a non-native language.
Right.
And I think that's a really interesting point because we often think of language as just a neutral tool for communication.
Yeah.
But it's so much more than that, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
tied up with power, with identity, with belonging. And the source talks about this idea of silent inequality, how a lack of fluency in the dominant language can create these invisible barriers that make it harder to access services, pursue opportunities, and just generally be treated fairly.
Mm-hmm.
And it also points out the control that fluent speakers have. You know, they can be interpreters, they can create documents, they can dominate conversations.
Right. And even subtle cues like an eye roll or a sigh of impatience can really hurt someone who's struggling with the language.
Totally. And the source talks about how the constant effort of using a non-native language, the mental fatigue, the helplessness, all of that, when combined with experiences of injustice and rejection, can turn into real anger and resentment.
Yeah. It's like a constant reminder that you're not fully accepted, that you're not fully part of the group.
And it describes this as a form of systemic violence that often goes unrecorded. It's not physical violence, but it's still violence.
Right. It's the violence of being excluded, of being silenced, of being made to feel invisible.
And it brings us back to this disconnect between surface judgment and underlying causes. We see the angry outburst, the violent act, but we don't see the years of struggle, the systemic barriers, the constant microaggressions that might have led to that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And the source is very clear that this is not about making excuses for violence.
Right.
It's about understanding the full picture, the context in which that violence occurs.
And it's about recognizing that we as a society have a responsibility to address those underlying causes.
Totally. And it also talks about the danger of blurring the lines between people with difficult social upbringings or trauma and people with personality disorders like sadism or antisocial personality disorder.
Right. Because if we treat everyone the same, we're going to fail a lot of people who could actually be helped.
Exactly. And the source introduces this really interesting idea, which is that good intentions and honesty aren't always the best strategies in a competitive world.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow, isn't it?
It is. But I think it's something we need to think about. Because if we're constantly being told to be nice and play fair, but the system is rigged against us, what are we supposed to do?
Right. And the source points out that marginalized groups are especially vulnerable in these situations because they often lack the resources and the power to compete on an equal footing.
And when those groups see their trust betrayed, their hope crushed, it can lead to that same anger and resentment that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the source gets really specific here, and it talks about the fires that have been happening in affluent areas like Los Angeles.
Right.
And it asks whether some of these fires might be deliberate acts by people who feel impoverished, failed by society, excluded from the wealth and opportunity that others enjoy.
Yeah. And that's a really uncomfortable thought, but I think it's one we need to consider.
It is.
Ugh.
And it asks whether these acts, while obviously wrong and dangerous, could be seen as a kind of extreme reaction to social inequality, a way of lashing out when all other avenues for change feel blocked.
Right. It's like a desperate cry for attention, a way of saying, we're here and we're suffering.
And the source even goes so far as to suggest that setting fire to symbols of wealth could be seen as a form of protest in a society with huge wealth gaps.
Mm-hmm.
So we've covered a lot today, haven't we?
We have. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has. And I want to turn it over to you, our listener. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Have you seen these pressures, these injustices in your own life or in your community? And if you're an immigrant, we'd love to hear about your experiences with government agencies. Did you feel understood and supported, or did you encounter indifference and bureaucracy that just made things harder?
Your voice matters. Your experiences matter. And by sharing them, you can help us all understand these issues better and hopefully work towards solutions.
Absolutely. So please leave a comment, send us a message, reach out to us in whatever way you feel comfortable. We want to hear from you.
We do.
And I want to leave you with this final thought. What if our assumptions about crime and punishment are just scratching the surface? What if the behaviors that shock and horrify us are often the result of unseen wounds, inflicted by systems and by indifference, just waiting for a chance to erupt? Something to think about, isn't it?
It is. It really makes you question everything you thought you knew.
Exactly. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.